All right, good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining the South Coast Conservation Program as we explore species at risk, the critical habitat tools. I'm your host, Christine Cooper. I'm a conservation planner with the South Coast Conservation Program. And today I'm just going to outline first how this webinar is going to go. I'm going to provide a welcome and introduction to the South Coast Conservation Program, followed by Adrian Pollard, who is the Manager of Environmental Services for the District of Saanich. She will be overviewing how Saanich has applied data from the Conservation Data Center in developing local government tools for their own mapping purposes and how that influences the policies and bylaws. She will talk about the experiences the District of Saanich has had applying conservation data in planning for species and ecosystems at risk. She's going to be followed up by Pamela Zevitt, an RP Bio and our Special Projects Coordinator with the South Coast Conservation Program. She will introduce the decision support tool that has been developed, that is being currently developed by the South Coast Conservation Program with local government help to protect species at risk critical habitat. The tool will be available direct to landowners and as a resource for local governments to provide during the permitting processes. And for this beginning first pilot project, we're working with the Pacific Water Shrew. Then there will be followed up by a question and answer period with the remaining time. The webinar is scheduled between 11 to about 12:30. We'll cut it off at. So just as to let you know, as an attendee, your mic is muted. But if you'd like to ask a question, please write it in the question box, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentations. We'll be recording the webinar, and we'll post it to our website. I will send it the link when it is uploaded. I'm going to just go through give you some information about the South Coast Conservation Program. It's a multi-partner collaborative which facilitates the protection and recovery of endangered species and ecological communities on BC's South Coast. My primary role is to work with local governments to increase capacity to deal with issues in land use planning concerning species and ecosystems at risk. We have a series of other programs, including our Landowner Stewardship Contact Program. We started this webinar series last year, with the first one exploring species and ecosystems at risk within the context of policy, recovery, and land use management. The second SCCP webinar as part of the series shared some local government perspectives, including Cities of Surrey's experiences with protection with species such as the Pacific Water Shrew. We also explored the stewardship baseline approach and provided some regional perspectives on local government involvement in species at risk regarding land use planning. So this third webinar will delve further and serve as an extension of this knowledge and capacity building for species and ecosystems at risk. And we'll explore the development and use of critical habitat tools. Moving on to our first presentation, Adrian Pollard is here with us. So Adrian is the manager, as I said, of environmental services for the District of Saanich for the last 18 years. After a career as a consulting ecologist specializing in wetland evaluation and development, her main areas of expertise are environmental policy and planning, urban ecology, and impact assessment. Adrian has a master's degree in corporate environmental and sustainability management from Monash University in Australia and is a professional member of both the Canadian Institute of Planners and the College of Applied Biology of British Columbia. So you can take it away, Adrian.
Thanks. And I just have a quick question. Am I operating the slides progressing with my own keyboard? Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, so my topic today is about using CDC data for local government, and I'm going to be using lots of examples from Vancouver Island as well as more detailed examples from our own experience here at the District of Saanich. And the CDC stands for the Conservation Data Center, which is a provincial government service. So just an outline of my chat today, how CDC data can be used by local government and possibly other organizations, tailoring the data for your own use, and things to consider when you're going to present, how you're going to present your information using CDC data, and how you should consider things for maintenance of the data. And throughout the presentation, I am going to try to include some interesting photos just to break up sometimes the monotony of PowerPoints. So here we see one of our local species at risk in one of our municipal parks. So first, it may seem kind of funny for a local government person to be discussing a topic all about the CDC, but it's really about our experience in using their data. And so just in case people aren't familiar with the CDC, I've just listed from their website their 4 primary functions, and the tools that are most often used by ourselves in local government are the BC Species and Ecosystems Explorer, which is a wonderful tool, lots of information, lots of ways to access it. So I highly recommend using that, as well as a CDC IMAP, so you can spatially see their data in any given area of BC. So I think they do great work, and today when I talk about using their data, please don't take anything as a criticism. The CDC collects data for everybody, and anyone using it has to tailor it for their own uses. It wasn't made for local government to do this specifically. So again, another photograph of the local coastal Douglas fir rare ecosystem that's found throughout Saanich, along with our Garry Oak ecosystems, and I'll show that later. So the uses for the CDC data for local government. Foremost, you can use it just as information for decision making, such as making maps for planning purposes. You can import the data and create your own GIS layers. You can also just create tables of data suited for your need. For example, we made a table of all the rare species and ecosystems that the CDC tracks in our municipal parks, and created a nice little table that parks workers could take with them in their trucks. So when they're working in a park, they'll have an idea of what they might need to look out for. In educational material, and I'm really thinking about public outreach here, you can highlight local species to generate interest in your parks or your ecosystems, whether they're on private land or public land. You can use the material to talk about the importance of natural areas and the value of ecosystems. From our own experience, that slug that we showed on the first slide, and mosses, we have realized, do not create the intended reaction that we were hoping to get. We thought that an interesting blue slug would generate a lot of interest, but really it just made people think, you know, why would we, for example, stop development for a slug? Maybe the Pacific water shrew, the topic of the next chat, would generate more interest. Everyone seems to love birds and flowers, so those might be rare species and ecosystems that people might have a greater connection to and understanding of. And so finally, policies and bylaws to protect and enhance habitat. CDC information is very valuable in that, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on mostly in this talk. So here's a picture of a typical Garry Oak ecosystem, rock outcrop area in Saanich in the fall. So policies. There's a lot of different policies. Most people are familiar with official community plan policies because they're very far-reaching and create sort of a template for what we do in local government, and they're specific for our community. You can also have local area plans, action plans, park management plans, strategic plans. These all have policies within them, and they're adopted by council. And you can also have policies that are more administrative and adopted by, created through the director and management level. So for example, in Saanich, in our OCP, we have this policy to protect and restore rare and endangered species, habitat, and ecosystems, particularly those associated with Garry Oak ecosystems. And we also have a policy that talks about addressing threats to biodiversity, such as invasive species. So these high-level policies are good to have to show that the community and council are behind this type of action. Here's a picture of an Oregon ash. We have a few up here in Saanich. There's a little bit of debate about how they got here and their status, but magnificent tree anyway. Okay, so bylaws. In the Local Government Act, Section 488, there's a section called Designation of Development Permit Areas. And I would recommend using the Green Bylaws Toolkit if you want more information about the designation of development permit areas. Category A is the protection of the natural environment, its ecosystem, and biological diversity. This is the one where you would use this in order to designate areas that are identified by the Conservation Data Center. So we did a survey of 10 local governments on Vancouver Island, and we found that with very few and minor exceptions, all of them have a Category A development permit area for riparian areas, and that's likely due to the riparian areas regulation. They all have marine shoreline development permit areas, which are very similar to the freshwater riparian setbacks. And they all have sensitive ecosystem inventory designations in their development permit areas. Then there are some, 5 of the 10 have non-RAR wetlands and water bodies, so basically non-fish bearing water courses, etc., protected in development permit areas. 4 have second growth. They may not call it second growth. Everyone has different terms that they use for it, but basically these are second growth development permit areas. 3 municipalities have nest trees included in their development permit areas, and only 2 have the Conservation Data Center data as a designation. Another nice photograph of a yellow montane violet, also found in one of our municipal parks, and we have quite a massive volunteer undertaking to increase and enhance that habitat. So Saanich and Nanaimo are 2 examples of municipalities on Vancouver Island that have included the Conservation Data Center's data in a development permit area. So why so few? Some of the municipalities identified that the CDC areas were redundant with sensitive ecosystem inventory areas, their second growth areas, or potential habitat areas that they've included in their development permit areas. So they felt that it had already been pretty much covered. I also wonder if maybe people felt it was too much work to make it fit into their development permit areas. And I'm going to have a look at that next. So here, this is using the CDC tool and zooming in on Saanich and looking at all of their rare element occurrences. So rare plants, rare animals, rare ecosystems. And so you can see, and I'm not sure if my mouse cursor is working here that you can see it, but even the gray area here, these are all, the entire municipality is covered with rare element occurrences. There's multiple layers, there's numbers everywhere. For some people, this is very exciting and awesome. So much data, so many possibilities. For others, it might be off-putting. I wouldn't think any municipality would want to just plop this into a development permit area without having a closer look. It's be too confusing and cumbersome. So these are the steps that we took to tailor the data for the development permit area that we have in Saanich to protect the environment. So first, if you have a really great GIS person to work with, it makes a huge difference. There are contractors out there as well as staff, if you're lucky, and it's pretty critical to have someone working with you on this. So the first thing that they did was they clipped the CDC GIS layer to fit our municipal boundaries and basically ignored the rest as a starting point. What we're really doing is trying to reduce it down to something more manageable. So the next thing we did was we considered removing polygons, and we looked at ones that are extirpated or historical or maybe questionable in the first place, or they have large margins of error, and I mean spatially, in terms of, you know, they have some data, maybe when it was collected it wasn't really very exact, or the landscape has changed since then. So they say, you know, for example, the plant was found in this general area, and you end up with a circle of where the plant was found. You might consider removing polygons that are already protected, and so that's what we found at other municipalities. They didn't use CDC at all because they felt that these areas were already protected. And also, some of these things may not even be in your jurisdiction. And how can that be after you've already done step number 2 of clipping them to your municipal boundaries? Well, I'll show you that in a moment. So really, the CDC data, as I said, has many uses for many different people. Therefore, local government has to determine what's appropriate and how does this data match with your objectives. For example, your OCP policies. So manipulating the database, we looked at things like, as I said, the relevance, like has this been seen in 50 years? The size of the polygon, maybe the margin of error is too big, maybe it's already protected, and perhaps the location isn't actually in your jurisdiction. So we use the fields on the right. We took those columns from the database because they all gave us clues to how relevant these occurrences were, the size, and the location, like directions to the site. Well, that might tell you, for example, well, that's not in Saanich, or that's not in my municipality, and that speaks to that margin of error again, and some of the data being older. You wouldn't want to lose it, that's why the CDC still has it there, but it may not be suitable for including in a development permit area. So here's just you'll see on the top of each column, those are the CDC names. I kind of squished it in to fit it onto a slide here, but you can see like they've got in the middle there, first observed, last observed, the viability of the population and the area in the last column. The ones in red were the ones that we thought those are just way too big to include in a development permit area, and it reflects the large margin of error, which is the cautious approach. So here's some examples of Conservation Data Center or CDC polygons that we elected not to use. There was a Granfir Dull Oregon Grape polygon with a massive area that we felt was not useful for our purposes. There was another ecosystem, Western Red Cedar Indian Plum, that was last observed in 1968. And we felt that that maybe wasn't solid enough for our uses. There was a rough-leaved aster, but the survey site said it was in Thetis Lake Park, which is not in our municipality, so we did not use that. And then Douglas fir arbutus, when we compared it with the sensitive ecosystem inventory, that particular polygon was identical. So we felt we weren't getting any additional use out of that, especially when sensitive ecosystem inventory is mapping the ecosystem, as opposed to, for example, if there was the habitat of a rough-leaved aster that was within an SCI polygon, we would have kept that because those are two different things, a species at risk versus an ecosystem at risk. So after doing that exercise, this is what our map looked like. So compared to the first one that I showed you, which was very busy and overwhelming, this is what we've ended up with. So you can see almost in the middle of the screen the green area, which signify parks. That's Mount Doug Park, and of course it's got lots of rare species in it. So we don't have the large circles and ones that are going to overlap with SCI completely. So that tailors the data into something that's more manageable, and people will have a higher level of comprehension looking at it. So some factors to consider when presenting CDC data, and I'm mostly thinking about in a development permit area as opposed to educational material. You have to think about buffers. In Saanich, we elected not to have buffers on the CDC information because we felt that with the margin of error that's already incorporated into a lot of the mapping, we couldn't justify an additional buffer. It really depends on how you set up your development permit area, whether you put the buffers in as a predetermined buffer or whether you say that a biologist needs to determine the buffer at the time of development. So that's one consideration. Another way in presenting, consideration for presenting is the scale. This is something that we learned the hard way. A lot of development permit areas, most of them are presented in a map that is the size, a piece of paper, a letter-sized piece of paper. We made a whole atlas, which we like, but we also put it on GIS, which allows people to zoom right into a scale that was never intended to be used for this kind of data. And so it confuses people as to you know, why is this area included when it's a driveway, for example? Well, if you're using a circle, as the CDC often does, it's going to capture things that aren't part of the critical habitat of a species or the ecosystem. So the scale is something to consider in how you present this information to the public. In development permit areas, a justification is very important. It's part of the structure of a development permit area that you need to write. And so the justification should be written in such a way that it shows the importance of species at risk. And you might want to also show how this fits in with your policies and other plans that you have. And of course, you have to decide what kind of activities are going to be exempt from the requirements and what the guidelines for development will look like. And also, you need to consider what does enforcement look like when somebody does something in one of these areas which does not fit in with the guidelines. How can you enforce this? There might be questions about that. We can talk about that later if anyone's interested. So for Saanich, we have our justification here in writing, which I won't read out to you, but it basically, it's short and sweet, and it just basically says why we've included CDC data and why we did not include a buffer. And we have many exemptions for minor uses of property because these are in our parks, but also on private property. And so people want to know, can I continue to maintain my property? Can I put up a little gazebo or a greenhouse? Can I do this? Can I do that? So the exemptions are really important to kind of set the standard for how much development pressure an area can handle. And the guidelines, we have 5 guidelines. The first one is basically saying that there are limits to development. We say that there could be a requirement for further study, and there could be a requirement for construction mitigation to protect the area during construction, and there may be some requirements for restoration. And we use the word restoration quite loosely. It could be invasive species control or doing some revegetation, or coming up with a plan over time to make small improvements. And on the right there you can see At the top, there's Blenkinsop Lake, and there's a rare element occurrence at the lakeshore, and so it's mapped along the lakeshore. Whereas at the bottom, in red, sorry, our Conservation Data Center polygons are in red. In the bottom map, you can see two red circles, which that's a rare moss, and they've put it in a circle because there's multiple trees with the moss on them, and so they've just put a circle around the general area. So you can see where you have different types of polygons. Just another example of a rare species here, the Propertius dusky wing, which loves those garryoke ecosystems. And so maintenance, I mean maintenance of the data. Obviously the CDC, they're the ones who maintain the database, but now that you've extracted it and put it into your own policies or bylaws, then you also take some ownership of it for the public. And so you might want to look at revising your mapping. Our goal is to do it every 5 years, where we will then compare what the CDC has with what we have and see if we're missing anything or if anything has since been refined, so we can update our mapping. Another issue of maintenance is being prepared to change the mapping once new data is available. So going to council and changing the mapping. For example, if there's a development proposal and a biologist is hired, they may refine the polygon, or they may find new rare species, and so we have to be prepared to go to council with minor tweaks now and then. One thing we did is we added our own polygon because we had some data of a rare species that the CDC hadn't processed yet, but we were going forward with doing our 5-year update, so we put one in ourselves and labeled it as such, as a Saanich polygon. And then evaluating how it is working after a few years of implementation is always a good idea. Going back and looking some of the cases that you encountered, and also some of the questions that the public's asking repeatedly, so you can update your educational material. Another rare species, the purple sanicle. So the Saanich Experience, we've had our environmental development permit area now for 5 years. We've had some recent pushback in the last couple of years, which you may have heard about. Most of the pushback is on the marine shoreline and SCI, not the Conservation Data Center polygons. I think there's more understanding of rare species and ecosystems and the importance of them, as opposed to the marine shoreline, which may already be disturbed, and SCI, which you can argue about the value of it if it has been disturbed or invasive species are present. We also discovered after this was launched that we had one historical polygon that snuck through and was accidentally included in the EDPA, and we also wondered were there any that we accidentally omitted as we went through the exercise of tailoring the data for our own use. And then there's concerns with the margin of error expressed by the public, despite the guidelines that we have that offer flexibility for not having to go back to council if you discover that you want to do some development, you've got a CDC polygon on your property, and a biologist comes forward and says, well, actually, we see the species there and it's not part of the critical habitat and this development will have no impact, then we have flexible guidelines to allow people to move forward without having to go back to council first. Despite that, though, we have found that people really look at the mapping as being inflexible and absolute, so it's just something to consider. Also, our experience in keeping up with the CDC, because it's their work to keep improving and adding to the database, and so we have to kind of keep up with that, and that can cause some difficulties because if it's not in a development permit area, if you haven't identified an area on the map, you can't then just apply the same guidelines as you would to a recent discovery as you can with one that's already mapped. And it's also important to remember that not everything important is mapped. Once you create an environmental development permit area, people start to think that that's all there is. Everything else is not important, otherwise it would have been included, and of course that's not correct. And then the scale of mapping, you know, again, people zooming in onto their properties in a way the data was never meant to be used. It creates the illusion of accuracy. You know, this line is showing the ecosystem boundary, for example, or the habitat of a rare species. You know, the mapping is not that accurate, especially if you zoom into a scale of 1 to 200, which you can on Saanich GIS. So we're looking at ways to possibly change how we present that data. So that's the end, and I understand questions will be after the second presentation. Hopefully that's right.
Yeah,
I hope.
right.
Okay, hope that was useful to people. And in closing, here's just a little piece of artwork that we had done by Christy Bridgman, a local artist, to illustrate incorporating habitat into private property. And so it's part of our branding, and we just like to show like what's possible in living next to a natural area. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really great, and that's a great image to end off on. Thanks, Adrian. It was really great and detailed. Thank you for sharing the application process and experience that you've had in the District of Saanich in applying that CDC data.